where you see the passing of time.
The crowds in St. Peter's Square are praying like mad for the Pope's life.
Where moments refuse to die.
This is a momentous hour in world history. This is the invasion of Hitler's Europe.
And where victory lives on.
Plenty of girls are being kissed by plenty of boys they don't know, and they do not care.
You can love it, hate it, embrace it, or turn away.
Lennon was shot to death late last night outside his apartment building.
But it is a past we all share.
Come on out here and give me a salute. Big Navy salute.
This is where yesterday has a home, where we wonder what it was like back then.
Go forward, knights, in safety.
And not too long ago.
His spirit must live on.
It's where history has its place and where the past comes alive. The History Channel.
World War II, the total war. Every country was affected. It was the most destructive conflict in the history of mankind. Pretty daunting stuff for a world still reeling from the carnage that was the First World War. This time, however, most believed that technology would be the key to victory. But in the end, victory depended on taking the enemy's land and keeping it. That task would fall to the common foot soldier who fought across Europe step by step, and in the Pacific, island by island. November 11th, 1918. The war to end all wars was over. The German military, the dreaded Hun, had been defeated. The world was safe and secure. Victory parades heralded the Allied triumph. The sound of cheering faded away, and the armies of the victors were disbanded and soon forgotten. President Wilson believed in peace for all time, and everyone wanted to get on with their lives. No one was interested much in war. Over the next 20 years, a man in uniform became an oddity. Some thought he was a bum who couldn't make it in civilian life, who had found a home in the Army. There were actually signs in restaurants that said, "No dogs or military allowed." To make matters worse, the Congress had slashed military spending and the Army became a token of what it once was. From the end of the war till about 1940, Army maneuvers in America looked like something out of the Three Stooges.
At the time, the U.S. Army had no equipment at all to speak of. It was just unbelievably bad. I mean, for example, we used stovepipes to simulate artillery. We used baby carriage wheels to trundle fake machine guns around on. You know, the Army had nothing. It had absolutely nothing. We had just been through a war which had turned everybody very sour on war in the Army, and nobody had any respect for the military at all. And the military had even less respect for itself.
But events across the Atlantic were nudging America to wake up and smell the coffee. World War II was blazing in Europe, and America could turn a blind eye for only so long. And in 1940, the Selective Service Act was passed into law. Once again, Uncle Sam was calling on the young men of America to fill the ranks of the undermanned regular army. It meant the bulk of the Army would be made up of civilians who knew as much about fighting a war as performing brain surgery. But what the heck? It was only for a year. America was still at peace, and it might be a great adventure. Little did they know. Then came the morning of December 7th, 1941. Any hope of remaining on the sidelines disappeared when the first bomb exploded in Hawaii. President Roosevelt immediately declared war on Japan. Germany and Italy then turned around and declared war on the United States. Before the week was out, nations representing half the world's population were in conflict. So much for America's neutrality. Raised the largest military force the world has ever seen and trained them post-haste. That was the order of the day.
When we instituted the Selective Service and started drafting people after Pearl Harbor, we examined over 20 million men. Of those, we accepted 11 million, and of the 11 million, 8 million ended up in the Army.
It was an incredible undertaking. 8 million men had to be turned into soldiers overnight. No problem. The Army had a field manual that told them how to do everything. How to salute, watch that thumb, how to dress, how to eat, how to sleep, how to make love, everything. The new GI was issued a wide variety of uniforms and equipment to suit the occasion and the climate. That included winter olive drab, Class A dress uniform, fatigues, M1 helmet, M1 rifle, trenching tool, canteen, gaiters, shoes and socks. It was easy to be color coordinated in those days because everything was the same color. Initially, the men were issued white underwear, later changed to olive drab. When someone decided white would be too easy a target, they thought the guys were fighting with their pants on. Like their uniforms, the men joked they too were government issue, GI for short, and that's how the famous nickname was born. Put yourself in the shoes of these young recruits. You've left home, perhaps for the first time, to join thousands of other young men, all facing the same rigors and hardships of military life. As civilians, most of you were still being awakened by a ringing alarm clock, a mother, or even a young bride. Now, it was this that roused you from your slumber and told you it was time to be a soldier. You're gonna make this sound good, right? Pretty good, huh? Reveille, get up fast. A favorite lyric of most GIs was Irving Berlin's classic, "Someday I'm going to murder the bugler." It's not known if anyone actually followed through with that threat, but a lot sure felt like it. Fall out, get into formation, stand at attention, roll call. This one, heard 3 times a day, was usually a welcome sound. Come and get the beans, boy, come and get the beans. For the recruits, the terms breakfast, lunch, and dinner ceased to exist. Instead, it was first mess, second mess, and third mess. Now, just how bad a mess it was depended on about how hungry they were. Actually, the Army fed its soldiers very well, and for good reason.
There's a saying that's been attributed to Napoleon, which may or may not be true, but it is accurate, and that is that an army doesn't march, it travels on its stomach. Basically what that means is, if you don't feed the troops, if you don't give them enough to nourish them, they can't perform their job.
The American Army was the best fed army in the world. Even deep in combat zones, a good commander would try to get hot food to his men. How tasty was it? Bill Malden, Pulitzer Prize-winning cartoonist for the Army paper Stars and Stripes, had a rather definite opinion about this.
Forgettable. That's all you can say. It was just forgettable. It was slop, you know. I came from a family of bad cooks. My mother and grandmother were both terrible cooks, but they were a lot better than what the Army had.
No one, however, disputed the effectiveness of the Army's primary weapon, the Grand Rifle, the M1. It was to be their sweetheart, their wife, their mother, all rolled into one. What a creation. They would learn to disassemble and reassemble it blindfolded. They would sleep with it, they would clean it and oil it, and it wouldn't let them down. It was the best individual firearm in the world.
Now, it's gas operated, and when you pull the trigger and fire it, what happens is this bolt is blown back, throws the empty cartridge case out, loads a fresh one, and you fire it again. The infantryman's basic tool, as this was, believe me, he took care of it. And the last thing the American or any other soldier did at night before he went to bed was make sure his rifle was clean. And the first thing he did when he got up in the morning was make sure his rifle was clean, because it was more to him than anything else.
Bill Malden understood the special relationship between a soldier and his rifle.
The guy talking to his rifle, I've given you the best years of my life. And that's how he felt about it. And I got it all into the picture somehow, you know, the sadness, the devotion. A rifle is your best friend.
As the young recruits prepared for battle, the war raged on. Anxious men in the Pacific were waiting for help, while the British in North Africa were hanging on with grim determination. Before the new soldiers could be shipped out, their training had to be completed. And so it continued, day in and day out. Which is not to say that basic training was completely lacking in good times. For one, there was payday. Once a month, a buck private's pay a princely sum of $21. Then, weekend passes into the local towns, where the boy soldiers tried to prove they could drink more beer than anyone in history and love more girls at the same time. Now, the locals were pretty tolerant. They knew that in the not-too-distant future, some of these young men would make the ultimate sacrifice. A welcome sound of the bugle after a long day of basic training, taps. Day is done, gone the sun, lights out. The men were usually exhausted and quickly fell to sleep. Soon they would sail for distant shores. New York City Harbor, early 1942. The American troops were being sent overseas. Huge convoys were assembled and men and equipment were loaded onto waiting ships to brave the North Atlantic. Lurking beneath the surface, ready to strike at any moment, menacing U-boats, the so-called wolf packs of the German Navy, which had already exacted a heavy toll on our merchant ships. Most of the men had never traveled very far from home. Suddenly, they found themselves aboard giant ocean liners like the Queen Mary for a journey of thousands of miles. But this was no luxury cruise. No time for relaxing in lounge chairs and sipping champagne. The Queen had been painted gray and stripped of her peacetime trappings. 16,000 men were somehow fitted into every nook and cranny for the crossing. Just like the Queen Mary, every ship was filled beyond capacity as they ventured out from New York Harbor into the open sea.
I guess we must have had about 3,000 or 4,000 GIs down the back of the ship looking back. And the last thing you could see was the head of the Statue of Liberty and the arms sticking up. And it really made me feel kind of strange, and I wondered if and when I'd ever see the Statue of Liberty again. That was my thought at that time. It was very, very, very touching, very impressive. And I think most of the other guys felt the same way, because nobody knew.
Life aboard ship left much to be desired. The men were packed in like sardines. Now, if the seas were rough, many got seasick, and green became the basic color of the day. However, if the seas were calm, The soldiers practiced abandoned ship drills forever and fought back the fear of enemy submarines. The men slept in shifts. Half the force remained on deck, while the other half was below in the ship's hull sleeping.
Each soldier had a bunk. That's enlisted men. He had a bunk about 6 feet long, 2 feet wide, and about 2 feet between bunks. That's all the space he had. And there were 5 levels. On each level, there were 5 high. And alternated like that every 12 hours.
A sacred service tradition was observed when and wherever possible. Poker. On deck or in smoke-choked rooms. The smoke was so thick you couldn't see the floor sometimes. Gambling was one of the great pastimes of the war.
Gambling was very lucrative to a significant number of men. Some of the poker games are legendary, and a lot of men came home, including my father, with enough money to start a business just because of the gambling. And that was pretty good. In fact, an obscure Navy officer named Richard Nixon was able to make enough money playing poker, which he was considered to be really good, that he was able to finance his first political campaign.
A poker face is a strong suit for a politician. The first Yanks to land in Europe disembarked in Liverpool, England. From there, they would launch a massive assault against French North Africa, Operation Torch. Training was intense and included all kinds of practiced amphibious assaults. Paddling heavy rubber boats through pounding surf wasn't exactly like guiding a canoe across a moonlit lagoon. Men knew something big was on the horizon. But what? They weren't sure. They only knew they had received a raise. A private now earned over $50 a month, making them the best paid army in the world. In November of 1942, the time came to earn those extra dollars. The mission was simple: come ashore in French North Africa before the Germans could occupy the entire region. The problem was not knowing how the French would react. Ever since the surrender of France in 1940, the Vichy government was subservient to Hitler. And at the moment, Hitler was winning. The politicians and the high brass decided to appeal to the French. We said the invasion would liberate them from Nazi tyranny. President Roosevelt prepared a special radio broadcast that would play with the landing. G.I. Joe wasn't particularly interested in the politics of war. If anyone shot at him, he would shoot back. It didn't matter if he was French, German, or Martian. Let the generals figure out the big picture. Survival was the name of the game.
It was an experience that you were trying to survive. The experience of living was something you were trying to survive. The big brass was so remote to the average soldier that he didn't even think of it. Just he had nothing to do with it.
The invasion force consisted of assault troops and airborne. The average soldier would land in North Africa and, loaded down with an M1 rifle, cartridge belt filled with M1 ammo, suspenders to hold up the cartridge belt. I tell you, the Army thought of everything. 2 canteens of water, water pills, 2 extra bandoliers, a compass, trench knife, a change of underwear and socks, better safe than sorry, a gas mask, steel helmet, and a little American flag sewn on their shoulder to let the French know we were the good guys. This would be the first test of the newly trained United States Army. The British, Australians, Canadians, and New Zealanders were battle-hardened veterans by comparison. These men would be the first U.S. troops in combat for the Battle of Europe. Do you believe this? I feel like a polar bear in Texas in August. The Americans had been planning the invasion of North Africa for months, but for some unknown reason, they decided to outfit the men like they were marching into Norway in December. But you know what? North Africa is hot. It's a desert. Africa, hot. The boys were broiling. This was just one of the many mistakes the Americans made as they entered the war. Snafu was an expression used by the GI. It meant situation normal, all fouled up. Actually, a slightly stronger word was used. Now, Operation Torch, the invasion of French North Africa, was about to be all fouled up. Snafu 1. President Roosevelt's recorded radio address to the French in North Africa telling them liberators were coming played before all the invasion forces were ready to land. Vive la France, the president concluded, and the element of surprise was gone. Snafu 2. The French didn't quite know whose side they were on, began shelling the ships. Snafu 3. Airborne troops dressed for combat in Northern Europe, including long john underwear, dropped into a dry lake bed 25 miles from their objective. Snafu 4. Landing boats were being swamped in unpredicted high tides. The final snafu, the men were weighed down with more equipment than they could possibly manage. Undoing the snafus, the men began taking matters into their own hands. By the time the paratroopers started marching toward their objective, the desert was strewn with olive drab long johns and other non-essential items. This was perhaps the birth of the foot soldiers' ingenuity in World War II, using what was necessary and tossing the rest. In spite of huge planning snafus, the invasion was ultimately successful. Algiers and other key cities belonged to the Allies, but U.S. soldiers had paid for it with their lives. Ironically, the first blood spilled was caused by a once-and-future ally, France. They had been through their baptism of fire. They were now combat foot soldiers, and with victory came liberty and the urge to mingle with the locals. Well, certain locals. Like armies since time immemorial, the average American G.I. Joe had three favorite activities when there was a lull in the fighting: drinking, gambling, and womanizing. Now, anyone who guessed needlepoint macrame and flower arranging, sorry, try again. This profound interest in fraternizing with the opposite sex would hold true as the war progressed through Sicily and into Italy.
Americans had no trouble getting dates with the local women in these areas. And again, this was just a cause of resentment among a lot of our Allied soldiers who were supposed to be fighting alongside of us. Whether it was Australia or England, there was the same expression about Americans, and that was overpaid, oversexed, and over here.
When the GI returned from a pass into a rear or occupied area, he would often have to stand a mandatory personal hygiene inspection of a rather personal nature. Men were urged to use condoms and their pro kit. Flunking the test carried heavy consequences.
They would line everybody up and make them show their equipment. And any time lost, due to venereal disease, you had to make up at the end of your enlistment. So there were all sorts of incentives to not catch anything. Didn't work.
After viewing the classic training film on venereal disease dubbed the VD Special, many men swore they had become celibate, though I wouldn't bet on it.
Toward the end of the war, the U.S. Army did a study, a psychological study of their soldiers, and one of the things they asked them was how many sexual experiences they had while they were soldiers in each theater. In the European theater, the average was 4 different women that they had sexual experiences with when they got over to the end of the war.
Thoughts of the opposite sex were momentarily forgotten as the biggest amphibious invasion in the history of the world was planned and then executed on June 6, 1944. D-Day. France was invaded at 0630 hours. In civilian parlance, 6:30 a.m. An early time to die on a distant shore. Brave men were frightened. The average foot soldier must have felt very tiny in the face of the immense invasion forces. Maybe he didn't count for much. After all, he was just one little guy, an insignificant cog in a massive machine. But in truth, Without his contribution, without his blood, there would be no victory for the Allies. No soldier will ever forget the sheer terror leading up to battle.
My thoughts about whether I was going to be killed or not was, I think, up to fate at that time, because every time you land on a beach, you know a lot of people are going to get killed. You're scared as hell. You can expect to have casualties, you know that much, and somebody's going to die, and somebody will probably survive, we hope, anyway. You're only concerned with how you're going to get out of this thing alive, I guess.
As the American foot soldiers marched across the face of Europe, they shared the same fears, the same concerns of millions of fighting men from centuries past. They knew they would see death, many for the first time in their lives. But imagining it was never the same as the horror of actually seeing it.
The Germans started shelling the bridge, and a shell struck the side of this courtyard and exploded and blew the peep driver and the lieutenant out on the ground and tore their clothes off of them and burned them. It just horrible. It really made me sick. And the building was on fire, and we passed by the courtyard, looked over there, and I saw those two. They were just naked bodies burned. They just looked like they were burned black and red. It was just horrible to think of those guys. Of course, it killed them instantly. They weren't suffering. But it really upset me. I knew that it'd see dead people, but I just didn't think it'd be like that. And it really shocked me.
An incredible buildup of supplies was needed to sustain the life of the average American G.I. Joe, like an umbilical cord from the mother to the child. If the supply line to the soldier was cut, he would wither and die. Fortunately, he could live without the many taken-for-granted luxuries of civilian life, like plumbing, for example. The unsanitary conditions provided fodder for Bill Malden's humor mill.
I got pretty good at drawing mud. Mud is very much an element of life in those days. They're in mud up to their asses all the time.
Now, Malden shows all these grizzled empties, so a lot of them had beards because they didn't have a chance to shave at all, but I could generally shave maybe every 3 or 4 days. And personal sanitation is hard in the field, but you get used to it.
The GI also got used to living like a gopher. Capture a foot of ground, then dig in for the night. Over the course of the war, the average soldier may have dug as many as 1,000 foxholes, holes that became his hole away from home. And what did he eat? A little surprise carton he carried in his pack supplied the answer.
We started with what were called K rations, and that was a lot of dehydrated food. It included coffee crystals, as a matter of fact, which was the beginning of instant coffee. It included canned meat, which is where Spam began. And these were the things that the men took with them. They had enough for several meals, and they could carry several days' rations on them if necessary.
And not all of the goodies were universally liked. A little packet of lemon crystals, when dissolved in water, it was supposed to make lemonade, was so universally hated that the soldiers used the solution to clean floors back in the barracks and do their laundry. I think this was the forerunner to that lemon fresh scent of modern detergents. On December the 16th, 1944, Hitler ordered a massive counteroffensive along a 40-mile front. It became known as the Battle of the Bulge because of the huge dent it made in the Allied lines. It was Germany's Christmas present to the weary foot soldier. Everywhere casualties were high, and the medical corps was working overtime. Now, some of the men were hoping for that $1 million wound, a wound that might get them home for Christmas.
Basically, it was a wound that wasn't going to make you lose your arm, your eye, your leg, but it would get you home. In most cases, though, the doctors were very, very tough about letting guys get sent back. If they could do anything to get you fixed up and sent right back to your unit, they did, because they needed the men so badly.
But none of the American GIs surrounded by Hitler's surprise counteroffensive were going to be headed home, at least anytime soon. Many were holed up in the ruins of the small Belgian town of Bastogne. They weren't even going to get the traditional Christmas turkey dinner with all the trimmings the men in the rear areas were enjoying. For them, it was K-rations and anything that they could forage or plunder from the ruins of the shattered town. They found coffee and flour, chickens and cows, but the most welcomed find was 2,000 burlap bags. 1,000 foot soldiers without weatherproof boots got a great present that day. Burlap to wrap and tie around their feet. Someone remarked it was like Valley Forge all over again. Laughter was heard echoing across the snow, but it was punctuated with rifle fire. There would be no day off from fighting that Christmas. Christmas 1944 was not one of your more festive holidays. As Allied troops huddled together in an icy corner of Belgium with burlap wrapped around their feet for warmth, half a world away, another group of foot soldiers was enduring a different kind of hell on islands in the far reaches of the Pacific. Men sat down for a less than joyous holiday feast, cursing the heat, the swarming insects, and the relentless enemy.
These guys were suffering at different levels, and to say that winter in Northwest Europe was worse than steaming hot jungles in the Southwest Pacific is not really relevant. The fact is there were hardships everywhere, and you just wanted to get through it and get home.
The Japanese soldiers honored their homeland too, and they knew the divine emperor was on their side, and they would fight to the death for him. But there was no question that God was on our side. We were the good guys, and they were the bad guys. How the Japanese felt about that? Well, no one bothered to ask. The story of the foot soldier in the Pacific began in the Philippine Islands with one of the most infamous marches in military history, the Bataan Death March. As always, they would go by foot. The half-starving prisoners, many of them American, were forced by their Japanese captors to walk 65 miles in unbearable heat with little food or water. 25,000 died in the final battle and the march. The destination? Camp O'Donnell, where they were incarcerated. Another 22,000 died while being held prisoner. The Japanese earned their title as the bad guys and inflamed the fighting spirit of the Allied soldiers, now driven by a powerful thirst for revenge. At the same time, the soldiers were spurred on by the justness of their cause and their fervent desire to preserve the good old American way of life. Mom and apple pie and the girl next door. Nothing brought the men in battle more comfort than mail from home. Mail calls brought the men running. Even in the far reaches of the Pacific, somehow the mail always got through, one way or another.
I mean, mail from home, good Lord, manna from heaven. All right, here's a situation where a Jeep hauling mail has hit a mine, and there's mail all over the landscape. And the guy who had been driving the Jeep says, "Why are you looking so sad?" I got out of it okay. It was the most valuable commodity anybody had, I guess, really.
World War II was the era of the pinup girl. Such sultry vixens as Betty Grable and Rita Hayworth, and scores of others, whose curvaceous figures raised the spirits of even the most battle-weary veterans. Let's face it, when you're in the middle of nowhere, it dodging bullets every day, it's nice to know what you're fighting for. The men slept with these visions over their heads, and sometimes dreams came true. The stars came to you. The USO brought live entertainment as close to the front lines as possible. For a brief moment, the war was forgotten.
There were a lot of USO shows and a lot of celebrities, and most notable being Bob Hope, who brought big-name people into the areas, and the men really appreciated this, that here they were in God-forsaken wherever Pacific Island or cold, frozen Northwest Europe at Christmas time, and there was somebody there trying to make their lives a little better since they couldn't be home for Christmas.
The Americans weren't the only ones fighting far from home. The sun had not yet set on the British Empire. America's allies who battled in the islands fought to see that it wouldn't.
The Australians and the New Zealanders fought in New Guinea, which was probably the worst theatre of war on the globe. It was really terrible. Deep jungle, impenetrable jungle. Wildlife and insect life, disease, mud, rainfall, Japanese troops, all at once. It was hellish. American troops were there as well with the Australians in New Guinea, and I think they will agree that it was probably the worst theatre of war of all.
Because of the density of the jungles and the Japanese snipers in every tree, the men often remained in rain-filled trenches for long periods of time. Dead comrades sunk to the bottom, and maggot-filled corpses rose to the top. The grim scene could cause one to gag. The realities of combat were mind-boggling. Thousands never recovered from the shock of war. Often the battle for survival was against the elements and disease more than the enemy. The jungle soldier adapted by throwing away the field manual and coping in a practical way. Neatness in the South Pacific didn't count for much. Destroying the enemy, taking his ground from him, and driving him back into the ocean did. And by 1944, that's just what the Allies were doing. Marines had been doing most of the island hopping, but the Army fought its fair share in the Pacific as well.
The U.S. Army had quite a few divisions in the Pacific, and particularly they fought in the Philippines. Certainly, if we had gone in and invaded the home islands of Japan, it would have been a big Army show as well as Marine, and their contribution to the Pacific War should not be underestimated.
By January of 1945, the Allies had reclaimed nearly all of the Pacific Isles. True to his word, General of the Army Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Allied Commander in the Pacific, returned to the Philippines. History records that as he waded ashore, well in range of sniper bullets and cameras, he uttered the immortal words, "I have returned." But his main concern was liberating the POWs he had left behind in 1942. This he did, to the joy of the common foot soldier who had suffered so greatly. 2 more Japanese-held islands would fall in 1945 after fierce jungle fighting, Okinawa and Iwo Jima. Even as the infantry in Europe was moving into Germany and toward Berlin, the plans for the invasion of the Japanese mainland, Operation Olympic, were being finalized. The projected loss of life would be staggering. An estimated 1 million Allied servicemen could die. The Japanese would fight to the death in defense of their sacred homeland. Everyone held their collective breath and prayed that this mass destruction could be avoided. January 1945. It had not been the kind of white Christmas that the besieged soldiers at Bastogne dreamed about. When the weather cleared, belated Christmas gifts fell from the heavens. Much-needed supplies courtesy of C-47 cargo planes. short order, the battled bastards of Bastogne broke through the German defense. The Battle of the Bulge was over, and the Allied advance was on. Leading the charge, General George S. Patton and the Third Army. They had attacked the Germans from the south in a brilliant maneuver Patton called a detour. The typical American soldier had a love-hate relationship with General Patton, known as Old Blood and Guts. One GI said, "Yeah, his guts, our blood." Some saw humor in it.
Bill Mauldin, the cartoonist, he fell foul of Patton, and he put a cartoon in the Stars and Stripes. And it was Willie and Joe, his two famous characters, were driving their Jeep, and they arrived at a large notice that said, "You are now entering the Third Army, commanding General Patton." And Willie and Joe, as one saying to the other, "I think we'll better ring the old man and tell him we're going to do a 300-mile detour."
Yeah, this was one that really had Patton roaring with anger. This was an affront to him. It was aimed right at him.
In fact, G.I. Joe managed to find humor in just about every bleak situation he found himself in. It was his way of getting through the fear and horror. But then, as he advanced into Germany, the unimaginable. American GIs began to stumble upon concentration camps and forced labor sites, where they came face to face with the victims of Nazi atrocities.
I saw this creature walk out behind this building with no facial flesh at all. It was just a skeleton, just a complete skeleton. And this creature looked at us and kept on walking. And then when it stopped, it just stopped and fell down dead.
No humor, even the blackest, could ever blot out these grim pictures from the minds of the foot soldiers. His trip through Europe had given him an insight into the infinite possibilities of man, for good and for evil. The war was winding down. Total victory in Europe was near. The Red Army of Russia, because of the heavy loss of life they had suffered in their drive from Moscow to Berlin, was permitted to enter the battered capital of the Third Reich first. The GIs and the British waited. The Russians were called our ally, but the individual Soviet soldier would remain a mystery to the friendly GI.
I think the individual Russian soldiers, too, were perfectly prepared to be friendly. But there was a political element that crept in between and spoiled what could have been a very great friendship.
The Cold War was beginning, but the average soldier was too busy to notice. Word went out that Hitler had killed himself, and the troops cheered. And then the word came, it was official, the war in Europe was over. VE Day and celebrations followed. But war continued in the Pacific. The Japanese refused to quit. And troops braced for what would be the invasion of Japan. It wasn't to be. In August of 1945, President Harry S. Truman made a fateful decision. Hiroshima, and 3 days later, Nagasaki, both obliterated within a matter of seconds. No foot soldier will ever forget where he was when he heard the outcome of that news. First Lieutenant Belton Cooper was relaxing in a European movie house, waiting to be shipped out to the Pacific.
And then over the loudspeaker came this BBC broadcast saying the Japanese have agreed to unconditional surrender. And I thought, here were 3,000 men sitting on death row, and all of a sudden we'd gotten a reprieve. Well, it was an awesome shock. Some of the guys just fell out on the floor and started screaming and hollering and crying like babies. Some of them just fainted dead away. I stood there and said a silent prayer. I thank God I'd been a survivor.
The answer to any of this stuff is survival. That's all anybody was trying to do, was survive. That's all. You survive things. You survive experiences.
Once again, the survivors around the world celebrated with joy and wild abandon. The foot soldier was asked to use his tired, aching feet one more time. Victory parades all over the globe.
If you want to win a war, you can have all the air forces that you want. You've got to have soldiers on their feet, on the ground, with weapons in their hands. It's the only way to win wars. Now and forevermore.
The guy is holding the rifle, and he's turning it in, which you had to do at the end of the war. And he obviously has a great emotional attachment to his rifle. And he says to the clerk he's giving the rifle to, please try to find her a good home.
As the foot soldier of World War II marched off into history, he left a proud legacy behind him.
If there's a legacy for the American foot soldier, the American GI in World War II, it's this. Most of them were drafted, didn't want to be in the Army, probably didn't like it, but our GIs, our frontline infantrymen, had to do the job. They took the risks, and they won the war.
The young boys who had marched off to war returned as battle-hardened soldiers. They were men who had fought for their country, helped save the world from tyranny. Quite a responsibility for a generation of country boys and city dwellers who had been transformed into soldiers. Now they were back home again, safe and protected. The weapons of war fell silent.